This is a vascular kind of review, or preview, I should say. Need some of it for Doppler. Not a lot, though. So hopefully this is what you'll look like over the Christmas break.
Yeah.
So.
Like the moment.
That's not
I'm just saying. I'm just saying.
If you've been to Oktoberfest in Munich, oh boy, is it fun. Okay, hemodynamics. And I actually don't know if that, yeah, it would have gone across. Okay. Hemodynamics. So this is blood flow, okay? Big college word that means blood flow. Movement of fluid from one location to another. Something you should know is that blood is going to flow from highest pressure to lowest pressure, okay? And a better way of actually saying that is blood flows from the most energetic point to the least energetic point, all right? What's the most energetic point of the body?
The heart.
Okay, the heart's pretty energetic. Let's get more specific.
Right.
What part of the heart does the blood flow start in? The left ventricle, right? Correct? Yeah, the right ventricle is going to take it to the lungs. But for the rest of our body, we're thinking left ventricle. Left ventricle has the highest pressure in the body. Where's the lowest pressure in the body?
The right atrium.
Right atrium, yeah. Because it's got to get back there. So that's the lowest pressure, yeah. When we look at how much blood is flowing, we talk about it as the volume flow rate. Okay, that's how much blood is going through something. So we could say 5 liters per minute or whatever it happens to be. That's the volume flow rate. Just going to refer to that as the volume at this point, okay? You don't need to worry too much more about it. Got another term we have to think about, and that's the velocity of the blood. Okay? Blood in the venous system is moving very slowly. Okay? Blood in the arterial system is moving quicker. We call that speed of the blood and the direction it's going, its velocity. Okay? So velocity is speed and direction of the blood. Okay? Its units, of course, are centimeters per second, same as any other speed. And usually we see it around 100 to 120 in healthy people. As you get farther out on the periphery, it might peak up a little bit. When you get to the, seriously. Oh, man. So when the blood, usually about 120, but it can go up a little higher, 200 sometimes is normal. And then when you get out to the fingers and the capillaries, arterioles, it's moving really slow. In fact, in the capillaries, it's moving very slow. But anyhow, so let's talk about some different types of velocities that we see with blood. We have steady state flow, and that's when the blood is moving at a constant rate. We don't see that in the body very darn often at all. Okay, so steady state flow, if you want to think of water from a garden hose, you know, it's just coming out, right? It's flowing out, steady state. If you are looking at a vein and you suspend your respiration, you can obtain steady state flow. Another great place to see steady state flow is in the portal vein between the intestinal tract and the liver. Okay, there's no heart on either side of that. There's nothing pumping. There's no resistance, so to speak. So the portal flow will move from the intestinal tract into the liver in a steady state. Pretty steady. Sometimes some pulsatility. Pulsatile flow. This is what we see from cardiac contractions. This is arterial flow. Okay, it's pulsatile. Put your hand on your wrist. You'll feel pulsatile flow, right? You'll feel that pulsing action. Okay, arterial flow. Phasic flow is the flow that we typically see in the veins. And it's generally the, quote, pump on phasic flow is going to be the diaphragm. Okay, as the diaphragm raises and lowers, It's changing the pressures in the legs and the arms and causing flow to occur in a phasic fashion that goes with the movement of the diaphragm. Okay. There's an important concept called the flow velocity profile, and this has to do with how the flow is going through a typical artery. And so when you have steady flow through a round or nearly round object for a long period of time, it will develop laminar flow. And laminar flow means that it has different speeds as you move through the different towards the center of the vessel. Okay? In the very center of the vessel, the blood will be moving the fastest, and on the edges it'll be moving the slowest. On the edges, there's friction between the blood and the vessel wall, so it slows down. Okay, you go in a little closer to the center, and there's friction between the blood that's near the wall and the blood flowing, so it goes a little faster. And it continues that until in the very center of the vessel is the fastest flow. Okay? So that's laminar flow, layered blood flow. Fastest velocities in the center of the vessel, and slower velocities along the edge due to friction. Okay? And so we see this a lot in normal physiologic states. Okay? But I want to emphasize, we see this really only during systole, when the heart's just relaxing. Okay? And we'll get to that here in a second. I don't want to use you with a pretty picture and talk about something different. So, laminar flow, streamlines are aligned in parallel, found in normal physiologic states. There's two types of laminar flow, though. There's parabolic, which is what I just described to you. It's moving faster in the center, so you see this velocity in the center is fastest. And on the sides, it's slowest. And if you plot out the velocity differences between the center and then the sides, it forms a parabola. So we call it a parabolic laminar flow. Okay. Now, you have another type called plug flow. This can be laminar also, and this occurs during acceleration of blood. Okay. And what happens is that during acceleration, the stuff on the sides really doesn't get a chance to slow down because of friction, and it catches up with the stuff in the middle. All right? So there's just a narrower range of velocities that you're going to see. All right? So laminar flow is it's associated with this thing called a Reynolds number. We'll talk more about Reynolds number later. But if Reynolds number is under 1500, then we get laminar flow. Okay, and I don't know if you can see, I think the lights are down, you can see there's actually layers of laminar flow in this water coming out of this hose. You can kind of see these little layers as they're coming down, they're washing down, and you guys see that? You know,
You can see it a little bit.
a few people nodding their heads, a few people nodding off. It's all variable. Yeah, so we can see some laminar flow in there. That's a normal steady state flow. You turn on the hose and you see that. Okay, this is turbulent flow on the other hand. I'm not sure what the dog's thinking about it, but I'm sure he's not considering the Reynolds number. So turbulent flow is chaotic flow in all directions and speeds. There is no streamlines. Okay? We get large amounts of energy loss in turbulent flow. Energy is lost as sound, It's turning blood flow into sound in what we call a bruit. Has everyone heard of a bruit? Anybody? No? Okay. So sometimes doctors will put their stethoscope up against the neck and they'll go, oh, you got a bruit in there, okay? And that means that there's turbulent flow occurring, causing sound, causing the vessel walls to vibrate, and they call that a bruit. You see that with stenosis, and you see it with some other things that occur. Occasionally you'll get a tear in the vessel wall, and it'll flap and cause a bruit. Yeah.
Do you ever measure the flow for fistulas?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's going to be in, I think, the DMS 285 class or something like that. So a little farther down the line. Yeah.
So would this be when you're looking at a carotid and it bifurcates?
No, this would be when you're looking at a stenosis. So during the bifurcation, yes, you can get something called an eddy current at the bifurcation. Yeah, that can happen, but that's still going to be laminar flow in a normal individual. It's just dividing and swirling around in an organized fashion. This is disorganized, so this is not due to the carotid bifurcation. This is just disorganized flow associated with pathologic conditions such as a critical stenosis. Okay, we call it a critical stenosis if we see turbulence after it. Okay. So it can cause vibrations, it can cause bruits, it can be bad. It's also associated with a Reynolds number greater than 2,000. Okay? So, turbulent flow is associated with a Reynolds number of greater than 2,000, right? Okay. That's a test question, by the way. You'll want to remember that. Yes, ma'am?
Is a bruit basically like a murmur?
Yeah. Yeah, probably. Since I don't really know what a murmur is, I'm going to say yeah. I think they're very similar. I think a murmur and a bruit are very similar. I don't know. Sometimes they call them thrills, so who knows. Anyhow. Okay. Let's talk about the energy gradient as blood flows. And I told you that blood flows from high energy to low energy. I'm very true about that. But it's usually easier to think of it as going from high pressure to low pressure. There's an exception that occurs, and we'll talk about that. Okay. So energy in blood flow is incurred, it's caused, the word is imparted to the blood by the contraction of the heart. Okay, that gets us our energy. And as the blood flows, energy is lost. Should make some sense, maybe. We see energy in blood in three forms. Kinetic energy, that's the energy of motion. We see it in potential energy, and that's the energy of the blood pressure. And we see it in gravitational energy, and that's what we call hydrostatic energy, where when you're standing, your blood pressure in your head is lower than the blood pressure in your feet because of gravity. Okay? We don't worry too much about gravitational in this class. All right, we can lose energy through three forms. Friction, and we already said that the blood cells rubbing along the side of the walls get slowed down because of friction. So we know that there's friction that exists. Viscosity will cause us to lose energy. So if you think of honey, okay, it's very viscous, or molasses is very viscous, all right, and something like water is not very viscous. Okay, so if you take a jar of honey and you stir it up and then you stop, it just stops, right? There's the energy just is absorbed by that viscosity. If you take glass of water and you stir it up, you get a little whirlpool, you take your spoon out, and the whirlpool keeps going for a while, right? So it doesn't lose energy as quickly to viscosity, right? So that's how you lose energy by viscosity. Now, in all of your learning for viscosity, of all your hemodynamics from this point forward, you're going to hear about viscosity and how it's controlled by the hematocrit and all that. Well, guess what? It ain't a big deal, okay? Because if the hematocrit is enough to change the viscosity of the blood. What is hematocrit? It's the percentage of red blood cells in the blood, right? If it's enough to significantly change the viscosity of the blood, you're dead anyhow. Okay? So even a person who's extremely anemic, they have a very low red blood cell count, it's not that much different from normal. So let's quit worrying about hematocrit or viscosity. Okay? It's a factor in there. It's not a big deal. Okay? What does viscosity do? Well, you can just remember that it's the thickness of the blood, and yes, it can cause energy losses. Moving on. Anyway, it's a pet peeve of mine. They get into this thing about the viscosity of the blood and how it's so important. And it's like, no, it's not. It doesn't change that much. Okay, inertia. Inertia of the blood. Tendency of fluid to change, to resist the change in velocity. So if you look at the velocity of the blood, it really speeds up when the heart pumps. It slows down when the heart doesn't pump, right? Mm-hmm. That's what it's doing. Speeding up, slowing down, speeding up, slowing down. That is where you get your greatest amount of energy loss, okay? These inertial changes, as it speeds up and slows down and goes forward and goes backwards, that's where the energy loss is. Okay? So most energy loss in the blood comes from inertial changes. Speeding up, slowing down. All right. Energy of motion, kinetic energy. Kind of mentioned this. Energy of motion is determined by mass and speed of motion. Just remember it's the energy of the moving blood. Okay? I'm not going to make you memorize what is the equation? KMV squared. Yeah. 1/2 KMV squared. Yeah. We don't need to memorize that. We don't need to worry about it. It's just kinetic energy is the energy of motion. Potential energy in blood is the pressure, okay? So that's the potential energy. And you can bet, if you poke a vein, right, it doesn't go squirting out, but if you cut an artery, it goes squirting out, right? It has pressure. It can really move. And then gravitational energy, we don't get too involved in this, but it's just simply the fact that you have this column of blood standing there, and at the top, it's got less pressure than the bottom because of the weight of all the blood on top of it. Okay. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Okay. So flow occurs when the energy gradient exists between 2 points. Okay. So it's not truly pressure that makes flow occur, it's energy, but for the most part, we're going to see that it's mostly pressure. Okay. And we have 2 types of energy gradients, and the kinetic and potential. The kinetic is the energy of the flowing blood, and potential is related to the pressure in the body. Believe me, the pressure is the most important thing. There's one exception when it isn't, so we'll talk about that when we get to it. Okay, and so flow occurs when there's an energy difference between 2 points. Very simple. Okay. So energy losses in circulation, we already said energy is lost in 3 ways: viscosity, frictional loss, inertial loss. Viscosity loss is determined by hematocrit. Blood must overcome energy losses due to its thickness. Viscosity is measured in units of poise. because the Poiseuille was the person who did a lot of work in it. We'll learn more about Poiseuille later. Okay. Frictional losses occur when objects slide along one along the other and generate heat, such as blood sliding along the vessel walls, or say an arm sliding along a road from a motorcycle accident. Yeah, anyone ever seen road rash before?
Yeah.
Probably didn't need to see it again, right? Yeah, next slide. Okay, objects and inertial losses. This is not Einstein. This is Newton's quote. Objects in motion tend to stay in motion, right? So this is inertia. Objects at rest tend to stay at rest. So there's a tendency of fluid to resist changes in velocity. And we see inertia all the time. Pulsatile flow has inertia. It's starting and stopping. It's going up and down. Phasic flow has some inertial changes, not a lot, but some. And anytime we see velocity changes at a stenosis, we see inertial changes. Reynolds number, if you want to think of it, it's inertial forces divided by viscous forces, okay? Viscous being that viscosity thing, right? So Reynolds number conveniently has no units. It's just a number. You just say Reynolds number. Great. It has no units because all the units will cancel out if you do the math. It increases with increasing velocity. It increases with something called a characteristic dimension. Okay? It increases with the density of the fluid, and it decreases with the viscosity. So the viscosity goes up, Reynolds number goes down. Do you have to memorize those? No. What do you have to know about Reynolds number? I'm going to make it real easy for you. Yeah, over 2,000, we get turbulent flow. Under 1,500, we get laminar flow. Okay? What happens between 1,500 and 2,000? Two correct answers out there. Nobody knows and nobody cares. That should be a test question.
You said 1,500, less than 1,500?
Less than 1,500 laminar flow, yeah. And I've never seen that one as a test question either. I have seen the 2,000, but I haven't taken every test out there either. All right, stenosis. Stenosis is when you have a narrowing in the lumen of a vessel, okay? And you get changes in the velocity because of this narrowing, all right? After the narrowing, we see something called post-stenotic changes, post-stenosis. And a lot of times we'll see loss of streamlines, eddy currents, vortices, lots of flow energy converted into sound or tissue vibration. You get bruits, thrills. Bruits are vibrations caused by the blood flow. Thrills are when tissue is vibrated by the blood flow. What's the difference? I honestly don't know. But this was, yeah, I don't know. This was in the book, so I'm just copying it. Yeah. Decreased gradient of pressure across the vessel. And then you get a conversion of pulsatile flow into steady flow at some point. So this is a stenosis on the slide here. So I'll use this thing. So here we see an internal carotid artery. It's very turbulent, but we see some stenosis in there. And when we measure the blood flow in it, we get these high-speed jets of velocity here. This is like 500 centimeters per second. So that's pretty quick. That's a pretty quick velocity. And then you see also in systole, see it's still got high velocities in systole too. And you see the flow below the baseline, that means it's going the other direction. So it's going forward, it's going backwards, it's going in all directions. This is turbulent flow. The blood is spinning around doing all kinds of things. And we're getting some measurements of it. And that's what we expect to see in a very high-grade stenosis. Okay. And it's due to Bernoulli's principle. And Bernoulli's principle states that the sum of all the energies is the same everywhere. Okay. And I always like to joke that this was named after Bernoulli's brother, because Bernoulli had 9 brothers, and about 3 or 4 of them did significant scientific work back in the days when they were alive. But anyhow, Bernoulli, one of the brothers, came up with this idea that energy is going to be the same everywhere. There's this decrease, there's a slight change, but from any point to any point next to it, it's the very same. And so your velocity and your pressures summed together have to be the same. Or not summed, but multiplied together, have to be the same. And so what Bernoulli found that was during a stenosis, the velocity increases. Okay, at a stenosis, velocity increases. And this should make some sense when it gets narrow. If you take a garden hose and you put your thumb over the end of it, the velocity increases. That's Bernoulli's principle at work. Okay. What happens on the other side? The dog gets wet. You know, what's important about Bernoulli's principle? Velocities increase at a stenosis. Now, the truth is, at the stenosis, at this point right here, the pressure decreases a little bit. Okay? Because pressure is then converted into kinetic energy. Okay? So at that point, pressure decreases and velocity increases. When you get past it, you see the pressures come back up and the velocities go back down at some point. Okay? Does the pressure past that get back to the original amount? Not after a critical stenosis. But we're not going to worry about that today. Okay? For the most part, it reconstitutes itself. You go far enough away from the stenosis and you get laminar flow again eventually. Okay. All right. What's important about Bernoulli's principle?
Increase that stenosis.
Velocity of the stenosis increases, right. Okay. Let's talk about the pressure-flow relationship. Flow, in blood flow, we give the symbol Q, capital Q to it. Okay. It's directly related to the difference in pressures on either side. It's indirectly related to the resistance to flow. What causes resistance to flow in the body?
High viscosity.
So high viscosities, friction, inertia. The number one cause of resistance to flow in the body is the arterioles. Okay, they just close down, and that's what causes resistance. We'll talk about that. Okay. So we have this idea that flow can be related to pressure, and if you look here, we have Q equals the change in pressure divided by the resistance. Oh, I better have my little pointer on this side. So Q equals the change in pressure over the resistance, or rewriting that with algebra, the change in pressure equals the flow times the resistance. Okay? if the pressure gradient increases when the flow increases, the pressure gradient increases when the resistance increases. The flow increases when the pressure increases, and the flow increases when the resistance decreases. We find this analogous to Ohm's law, which we have to learn now. Because somebody that writes tests, and not me, trust me, I wouldn't have this in there, thinks that pressure changes in the body, flow in the body is equivalent to electricity.
Say what?
Yeah, just flow with me here a little bit. We'll get there. So fluid movement, they say, is analogous to electricity. If you consider that pressure changes are analogous to voltage, okay, and current is analogous to flow. Yeah, it kind of works out. You have these two coincidental equations, that the pressure gradient equals the flow times resistance, and in electricity, voltage equals the current times resistance. Okay, I could see where you could make that analogy. Okay, and they're saying pressure is analogous to voltage, and current's analogous to flow. Okay. So resistance in the arterial system, as I said, is controlled by the I misspelled that. Resistance in the arterial system is controlled by the arterioles. Probably ought to change that right now. Let's go down there. There we go. There. Miraculously spelled correctly now. Okay, resistance in the arterial system is controlled by arterioles. And so here's your analogous. So, what do you have to memorize from this slide? You have to remember that the pressure gradient is analogous to Ohm's law. That's one test question they use. The other test question is, what is pressure analogous to? Voltage. What is flow analogous to? Current. Okay. So there's your three questions. I think they should do away with all three of them, but that's just me. Yeah.
When I'm thinking about this, the only thing that I can think of is like they have like water flowing, they can like pull take energy from it. Like, is that what they're trying to do here?
No. So why are they doing this? It's because back in the mean old days, even before I started doing ultrasound, oh my God, that was a long time ago. Most people that got into ultrasound, in order to operate the machines, you pretty much had to be an electronics expert. And so they already understood electronics very, very well. So like my friend Don, who is retired, he's living up in Prescott now. You know, he was an electronics technician in the Navy back in Vietnam. And so he knew electronics like crazy. So when they went to explain flow to these people, they were like, oh, it's just like Ohm's law. And they all went, oh, okay. Well, now today what we're doing is we're explaining flow to you. And then we have to teach you Ohm's law because back in the day people learned Ohm's law before they learned about flow. So that's why it's still in there. And that's why I think we should get rid of it. Because I'm ready to move on to the 21st century. And unfortunately, the test is still in 1993. Parts of it. Okay. So let's move on to some more hemodynamics. And this is venous hemodynamics. There's something called transmural pressure. You don't have to worry about that today. So veins, in their normal state, veins are in what you see on the picture there is the low transmural pressure state. They look almost like little figure eights. They're collapsed down, there's some blood in it, they're just partially filled, and they're just hanging out, okay? When you increase the flow through them, rather than the pressure going up very much, what happens is they just expand. They start expanding till they can hold a lot more blood volume. Okay, so they go from something flat to something big and round. Okay, so the changes in shape with veins are associated with changes in venous volume rather than so much the pressure. The pressure pretty much stays constant. Again, not very much pressure in veins anyhow. But once it gets completely distended, it takes a lot of pressure to make it go beyond what it was. So you don't see high venous pulsatility. If you feel somebody's pulse, you're not feeling the vein, you're feeling the artery. Okay, the veins don't pulse. Change in volume. You know, the veins can hold up to 80% of the volume of the blood in the body. Yeah, they're a great reservoir. They have a great capacity to them. All right, hydrostatics. This is that gravitational pressure we were talking about. We're going to now call it hydrostatics because that's the more appropriate college term to it. The right atrium is always going to be our reference point for hydrostatics. It's the point of the body where the lowest pressure is, supposedly. So hydrostatic pressure is the blood density times gravity times the height of the blood column. So what changes, that's the height of the blood column. Everything else remains the same. The units are millimeters of mercury, okay, mmHg. Same units for pressure of air, right? So in the body, you can see high pressure. If you consider 0 at the heart, then you go down to the feet and you see an increase of up to 100 millimeters of mercury. If you raise your hand over your head, you're going to see a decrease where it can drop down as low as 60 millimeters of mercury below the pressure of the heart. However, that's theoretical. It never drops below the interstitial pressures of the tissues. And that's always going to be, I think, around 15 or so, 5 to 15. Don't worry about that today. That's coming up next semester in Doppler or whatever, vascular ultrasound, whatever Tabby teaches you. Just remember today that standing causes higher pressure in your feet, right, than your heart. Okay? That's hydrostatics. And then because our book talks about it, we're going to talk about hydrostatics of the laying down position. And just remember it's about the same everywhere when you lay down. Okay, so laying flat, hydrostatic pressure is negligible. I think he gets into a lot of detail about this. You know, don't worry about that. It's negligible. Okay. So when standing, hydrostatic pressure affects overall venous pressure. Okay. So venous pressure at the ankle increases with standing. With exercise, the venous pressure will lower a little bit. So if you're actually doing some exercise, you can drop your venous pressure a little. So these things change the pressure gradient and therefore the blood flow. And I know you guys don't want me to go into more detail on this, so I won't. Wonder who True B is. Another robocall. All right. Hemodynamics at rest. So when we're just sitting around doing nothing, sitting in our chairs waiting for class to be over with, Okay, so we have changes in our, so this, yeah, we could do this experiment right here today. Changes in intrathoracic and intra-abdominal pressure affect the venous return to the heart, all right? So during inspiration, you take in a deep breath, your diaphragm goes down, right? That increases the pressure in the legs. It decreases the pressure in the thorax. And in fact, it decreases it enough so that air in the surrounding room goes flooding into your lungs, right? Yeah. And then when we exhale, when we push out the air, diaphragm goes up, and the pressure in the thorax increases, forcing the air out into the room. The leg pressure drops, so the blood moves up, and that's how it works. So let's read what this says. It says, diaphragm descends, the pressure decreases in the chest cavity, causes blood to pool in the pulmonary vascular bed, okay, and then it increases intra-abdominal pressure. You guys have all done Valsalva maneuver. And then you do the IVC collapses, and venous return from the legs is impeded. So if you want your IVCs on your abdominal exams to be nice and big, don't have them take in a deep breath. Right? Deep breath's going to collapse the IVC. All right. Next slide, please. During expiration, diaphragm ascends, intra-abdominal pressure decreases, flow increases from the legs into the abdomen, and the pressure increases in the chest cavity. And then flow into the thorax is decreased because there's more pressure there, so it's harder to get there. Okay. There's a nice pretty diagram showing you the same in diagrammatic form. All right. Somebody just fell in the lab there. Breathing and venous flow. So I'm going to summarize this. This is a chart out of your book, but I'll summarize it for you. Venous flow in the legs correlates with movement of the diaphragm. The diaphragm goes down, flow goes down in the legs, venous flow. If the diaphragm goes up, expiration, flow increases in the legs. Just like the previous 3 slides, 2 sentences. There you go, got it. Now one more you got to remember. Venous flow above the diaphragm is the opposite. Diaphragm is the opposite. Venous flow above the diaphragm is the opposite. That's it. Okay? That's all you got to know right there. 2 sentences, 3 sentences. Okay? So venous flow in the legs correlates to movement of the diaphragm. Diaphragm goes up, flow goes up in the legs. Diaphragm goes down, flow in the legs goes down. Above the diaphragm, it's the opposite. If you get confused, draw a picture. Okay? So that covered the end of chapter 17 and all of 18. So let's see, save that. So Friday, we're going to do a little exercise, and we'll be moving from the room outdoors for this. Okay? And so Sasha, I'm sorry, we probably won't be in the classroom on Friday. You'll have to miss it. And it's just going to cover the hemodynamic stuff that we did today. All right? So,
Okay.
all right. So Friday, be prepared to go outside with me. We're going to do a hemodynamics learning experience.
With a hose?
Hmm? No hoses. Lord, no, I couldn't trust you guys with a hose.
The hose.
Oh yeah, I need to pick up your homework. Thank you.
You said you were going. I was like, Al, you.
Yeah, I meant to print out one today, but I was working on chapter 18. I was having so much fun on chapter 18, I just got lost. I ran out of time with what I did. So we'll have something for you on Friday. Fill up your weekend.
I'm telling you, he's a lot.
Mr. Doug, just for me to ask you about Saturday, or remind you about Saturday.
Saturday, yeah. I asked my wife last night, but I forgot what she said. So let me find out real quick
Did you
here.
ever figure out what you're doing?
What?
Did you ever figure out what
No, I have no idea what I'm doing.
So when my mom turned 60, we as a family all wrote down like 10 things that we loved about her, and we put together a little book like 60 things we love about you. So you could ask your kids, and that's kind of sentimental.
She would like that.
Anything you make.
She does strike me.
And you can put that on your kids and make them tell her all the reasons they love her.
Friday morning. But I can't do it after.
No, it was like 20.
You know, I do not send messages quickly at all.
You know you can talk to it, so you don't have to type. Oh.
Well, my problem is that I make sure all the punctuation and everything is correct.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, that's not the point of texting.
Yeah.
Your project doesn't have at least.
From Social Security Administration.
I bet it is. Okay, so no, I can't be here Saturday. I have to go to my son's soccer game.
Yeah, I'm going.
If I can.
She's like,
In the beginning, I did kind of went out, and now it's like, oh, the dog's not feeling so well. Yeah. Oh, I spilled some coffee on it. Oh, well.
Character. Yeah. Yep. Yes,
she's like our tummy bag and her little puppy, like in the store,
Oh
like.
my gosh.
Legit shop.
Oh, your puppy?
That's she's with her dad. This is her like shopping day in my life.
Thank you.
See you guys. See you tomorrow.
I can't think I would have some